All right, guys. So I have a question for you.
You want what are the numbers?
The
The
numbers
numbers
should be the
are
first question. Yep.
the numbers are number 74 in the 1970s on best ever albums. It comes in at number 5 in 1976, 291 of all time, and it is not in Rolling Stone's top 500 list.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that was my first question. What were the
Yep.
numbers, Matt? My second question is, hey guys, have you ever listened to classic radio before? Classic rock radio?
I sure have.
Yes, all the time.
And were you perhaps familiar with some of these songs on this album from the classic rock radio format?
I feel like I was alive in '76 hearing this album.
Matt, how about you? Did some of these songs sound familiar?
Nope.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah, there's a lot of rarities and obscurities on this album. We're going to talk about it a little bit. This album has one of the most fascinating origin stories of probably any album ever. I don't know how much you guys know, but guess what? I'm going to tell you all about it if you didn't know. So
Woohoo!
Strap in right now. I'm going to take you to a little place known as Boston, Massachusetts, okay? But before we get to Boston, Massachusetts, we probably should talk a little bit about the concept of Boston, because as a band, they're a very interesting band. In each Boston album, and there have been 6 of them, spread out quite a bit, with the exception of the debut and the second album, and we'll get into why in a little bit. But the one constant on all of the albums has been Tom Scholz, and Tom Scholz is a multi-instrumentalist, producer, inventor, very interesting guy. We'll go into it. And for guess what you would consider to be the classic Boston albums, the first 3 Boston albums, and then their 4th album, as well as their 6th, posthumously, unfortunately, on bits and pieces of it, vocalist Brad Delp is in it. So when you think of Boston or the Boston sound, which we'll define in a little bit, a lot of what you're talking about is Tom Scholz and Brad Delp. On all of the other albums, the drummer, the other guitarists and keyboardists and stuff like that have either been Tom Scholz doing that work in the studio and then session players going out and playing it, or occasional session players that play with him. Make sense so far in terms of what Boston is, okay?
Yep.
So, origin story starts with Tom Scholz in the late 60s. He is at MIT. He is a smart dude, right? He is a big fan of rock radio, the classics, right? 50s and 60s rock and roll, guitar sounds, and he is messing around, and while in his late 60s, he begins to write and record music. And the first track that he works on is Foreplay, which if you hear it from the early years, sounds remarkably similar to what you'll hear on this album. So while he's at MIT, he films a band with guitarist Barry Goudreau and drummer Jim Mazdia, and they would actually become members of the band for this album at times, and I'll explain how they fit in. They then find Brad Delp later in 1970, and they become a band. While this is happening, Scholz is graduating from MIT, and he gets a job at Polaroid. Okay, he's originally from the Midwest. He decides to stay in Boston after he's in MIT, and he gets a job at Polaroid. He makes good money, as you might imagine. You know, he's an MIT graduate, and he's going to Polaroid, and he's got a lot of skills. He takes this money, and he basically spends all of it to create a home studio for himself where he begins recording other songs. While he's doing this recording and different stuff like that, he's playing live shows with this band he's put together. They start with the name Freehold. They change their name to Mother's Milk, but then they kind of disband because everybody kind of says, well, I don't know if this is going to work out, including Delp. So they're all gone. So Scholz at this point says, well, you know, he's kind of at this point around 25, 26. For reference sake, the debut for Boston doesn't drop in 76 until Scholz is 29 years old. So a little bit older than your average, you know, rock star origin story, right? Especially at this time.
Yeah.
So he's in his basement studio. He is creating new guitar sounds using self-designed pedals. He is working on some songs. These songs eventually become Rock and Roll Band, Hitch a Ride, and Peace of Mind. He writes all of those in 1974. Keep in mind, he's got Foreplay, right, that he's been working on since 1969. And then in 75, he's crafting Something About You and More Than a Feeling. So he's got all these tracks. At this point, they're not touring. It's just Tom Scholz in his basement. So he invites over Brad Delp and says, I know, man, you don't want to be in the band or be in a band, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to continue working on this. I think you're a great singer. Can you sing over top of these demos? To which Brad Delp says, sure, no problem. You can go on YouTube and hear what those songs sound like. And the thing that stands out about them is how remarkably similar they sound to what ended up on this album. And we'll explain why in a second. So this is a long and meandering way of saying that Scholz at one point gives a Mother's Milk demo, the stuff he's working on, labeled as Mother's Milk. He gives it to a Polaroid coworker whose cousin works at ABC Records. And one of the reasons besides the proximity of this coworker, that he's interested in it is that one of Scholz's favorite bands is the James Gang, right, who are on ABC Records. So the employee forgets to mail the tape out, and it sits on the desk for months. Now, meanwhile, while this is going on, this tape is being sent everywhere. And remember, this tape has Foreplay, Something About You, Hitch a Ride, Peace of Mind, Rock and Roll Band, and More Than a Feeling, right? It's getting rejected left and right by everybody. Like, just that nobody sees anything. In fact, one record executive says there's nothing new on this album that hasn't been heard before, and basically dismisses it out of hand. Well, anyway, at one point, finally, it gets into the hands of Charles McKenzie, who is the New England representative for ABC Records. So it does eventually get into ABC's hands, right, when this coworker of the cousin finally sends it off. So he hears the tape in a coworker's office who's listening to this, I guess, demo tape, for lack of a better word. He calls a gentleman by the name of Paul Ahern, who's an independent record promoter in California, and they have a gentleman's agreement where if any of them hear anything interesting or they think has some promise, they would inform one another. So they decide that at this point, they're going to reach out and sign this band. So they're trying to figure out what did they sign, right? Because they've got Tom Scholz doing these songs, and they're like, hey, that guy singing over it, you know, he's pretty damn good too, right? So they have those two members, so they kind of say, who else is in the band? Goudreau is still there, so they kind of recruit him to be a player, and Jim Mazda leaves the band. He's just kind of over it, right? And he says, nah, I'm not going to go on this. So they recruit Fran Sheehan on the bass, and then Sib Hashian, who's actually the father of The Rock's wife, Lauren Hashian, for the drums.
Of course he is.
So they become the traveling, touring version of the band. So a way to think of this is kind of like Tom Scholz is sort of like the Brian Wilson in this band, like in the studio, but he's also going out on tour.
Yeah.
But they're signed without really being a live act. They're signed off this demo tape, right? So here's where it gets very interesting. The record says, you know, we like it, but we need you to come in the studio and we want you to record in a professional studio. And Scholz says, yeah, not so much. I want to record this in my basement studio. And they're like, no, really, you need to record this in the studio. And he goes, yeah, not so much. So,
because my basement studio is way better than your professional ABC studio.
Well, he says he was more comfortable there, and at first he was a little bit intimidated about going in front of record producers. You know what I mean? Because he's an amateur, right?
Okay.
So he flies to L.A. to check this out, and quickly in his mind figures out that he's better than all of these people. He thinks he says they're kind of hacks, and they're overpaid, and they just have all this stuff, and it costs so much money. So
a little bit of an ego on Tom Scholz.
Tom Scholz is proud of himself, but also he was able to articulate why he felt that way. He said largely they were just mixing dials, right? There was no innovation. And for a guy that eventually creates amplifiers and stuff, right? That's a big deal for him. So anyway, they hatch a plan, okay? And this along with Ahern, right? And this plan is that they're going to fly out everybody but Tom Scholz to LA, and they are going to record the album, right? In quotations. Meanwhile, Scholz is going to take those demos, right, and he's going to just work on them, and he's going to bring Mazda back to be the drummer for these tracks. So it's him, and then Mazda is playing the drums on these tracks, okay? So he records all of this and creates a master tape. He then flies to L.A., where the band is nominally recording, and when they go into the recording, they just put Delp's vocals over top of all the instrumentation that Scholes did, right? And then Maz just drumming. So you've got the singer who's actually in the band, you've got Scholes who's in the band playing everything else, and the drummer you hear on it is not even the drummer who's going to be the drummer if you were to go see Boston. That is what you hear on this album, is that combination of things, okay?
Wow, okay.
And so that becomes it. It only cost a few $1,000s for this album to be made because it was a DIY, and they basically, the only costs were the studio time, right, for the album. They didn't even end up recording.
Yeah, really.
So it's pretty remarkable. So
this is far different than any of the other stories. That
it's a very different story.
And it's probably a remarkably high return on investment as well.
Oh my God,
well, we'll talk about what it is in a second. So anyway, another funny thing about this is that at the beginning, this traveling version of the band, right? Scholes, Delp, and then the guy Goudreau, who's the holdover, right? And these other two guys, Sheehan and Hashian, agree to put out 10 albums in 6 years, which is freaking hilarious because we'll talk about why. It's just in general, but it's particularly funny with Boston when you know their origin story. So anyway, they take this out and they begin to open for like Sabbath and Blue Oyster Cult and Foghat. They get fired from the Foghat tour because they're introduced as the headliner and Foghat is the opener at one point. So they didn't, but the people did it and they got fired from it. So while this is happening, the album is selling massively. I'm talking huge. Like, it gets on the radio and pretty much immediately it starts selling like hotcakes, okay? By the time this album is done, this becomes the highest selling debut album of all time until Whitney Houston's debut album comes out. So this sold all kinds of copies. How many copies, might you ask? This album has sold more than 75 million albums worldwide, and 31 million albums Boston has sold in the U.S. 75 million albums for all of their albums, right? But this one alone sold 31 million in the U.S. and roughly 52 million worldwide.
Wow.
Okay, so it's pretty remarkable.
Wow.
So 31 million total sales in the U.S., of which 17 million are this one. 75 million albums worldwide for their career, of which this one is estimated to be like 45 or 50, right? So that's how much this sold. It's a mass. It's whenever you look at the list of biggest selling albums ever, right? Boston is always high on that. So it's important to know the aftermath of this too, because they become arguably the biggest selling band in America at this point in 1976.
They're arguably a band because they're so manufactured.
Well, right, and they're like this other thing, right? That's different, But this is the era of like Journey was studio musicians, right? Toto was a bunch of studio musicians who were like, hey, do music. Journey was sort of like a proggy band and stuff that hired Steve Perry like off the street, right? And changed their sound. Foreigner, those guys were another bit. So like all of these bands kind of have this feeling where they're like shotgun together, which is why it's funny because you talked about the Monkees, Josh.
Yeah.
And remember how much shit they got for being a manufactured, but now like everybody to some degree is a manufactured band. So the record company immediately begins pressing Scholes to do another album, which, as you've probably figured out with Scholes, he's not one that gets likes to be told what to do, right?
Right.
So he goes in and in his mind, he rushes this album out in 1978, so 2 years later. In that era, though, the expectation was that bands put out an album every year, sometimes even two, right? So they thought it was a glacial pace. And so Scholes is annoyed because he's a perfectionist, and even though the album sells well, he feels that it wasn't very good, and he's determined at this point that he's going to take as much time as possible to record his next one. Now, how this is going on, the album's getting annoyed, or the record label is getting annoyed the next album doesn't come, right? So at one point, the other members of the band break off and try to do a band without Scholes, but with his permission, and they can't call it Boston. The record label at first thinks they're going to promote it, but then it doesn't sell well, so they're annoyed, so they kind of go back to Scholes and say, when's this album coming? He goes, it'll be done when I'm done, kind of. And so CBS then files a $60 million lawsuit against Scholes for breach of contract.
CBS or ABC?
CBS Records at this point, because they have now come in possession of the contract of Boston, right? Because I think ABC is a subsidiary of CBS, right?
Gotcha.
So they filed this thing. Meanwhile, the other members of the band are just kind of sitting around and saying, well, I guess I wonder when we're going to make our next album, pretty much. Scholes, while he's recording this album that will eventually not be released until 1986, is also inventing the Rockman amplifier, which sells massively and gives him a second whole career. You may know the Rockman amplifier from pretty much the entire career of Def Leppard, Matt, because that is the Rockman amplifier is what they use for almost all of their albums. So this drags out for forever. Eventually, believe it or not, Scholes wins the case and ends up paying absolutely nothing to CBS and gets to move to MCA for no cost whatsoever.
Wow.
Of course, by the time Boston comes back in 1986, the album sells reasonably well. You may know the song Amanda, for example.
I'm gonna take you by surprise. Yeah, he's got good lyrics.
Yes. So Amanda, and then he holds off again until 1992, at which point the grunge sound and indie has basically wiped Boston
no kidding.
off of it. They come back later in 2002, where they become one of the earliest artists to release an album on mp3.com, and that album is a concept album in 2002. And then they release another album in the 2010s. That ends up becoming, so that is the 6 albums where Boston comes from. 76,
like one a decade.
78, 86, 92, 2002, and I think it was 2011, I believe is it. And from what I've heard, Scholes is still working on tracks that nominally will be the next Boston album.
Oh, look! So, that looks like it's 2013. Like, love it.
I'm sorry, 2013. Yeah. Got it. So what is the Boston sound that I talk about, guys? Because this is kind of the invention of AOR pop rock is this album, right? Where it breaks huge to me. So what is that sound? Because I've been talking about wanting to define the sounds. Here's how the Boston sound is categorized. Categorized by multiple lead and blended harmonies with guitar work, usually harmonized in thirds, alternating between electric and acoustic guitars that are layered. The harmonic style of guitar sounds violin-like at times, and often also involves complex multi-tracked guitar harmonies. It also features high-tech equipment that you would recognize as almost giving like a synthetic sound, but without using synthesizers. And that is sort of the amps and the pedals that he's using. And they talk about later, Journey guitarist Neil Schon uses this, ZZ Top uses this, and Def Leppard's entire album, Hysteria, was recorded using nothing but Rockman technology. So then in terms of the songs themselves, deep, aggressive, and comparatively short guitar riffs combined with ethereal, longer note vocal harmonies. So the guitar riffs are short and sweet, right, with the vocals being soaring, which, if you've ever heard More Than a Feeling, like pretty much describes that song exactly, right? And then that's kind of it. And so Scholes says that he also would consider Brad Delp, the singer, to also be part of the Boston sound because his voice is synonymous with it. Yes, for sure. Well, a lot of people say Boston is Tom Scholes, right? And there's a lot of, I think you even said that a couple episodes ago, Matt. You're like, oh, the guy Tom Scholes, right, from Boston.
Well, because he did all the instruments, but but the vocals are certainly stand out as well.
Right. So there you go. So that, I mean, there's so much else we can do with it. The story of how Brad Delp passed away, unfortunately, he committed suicide in a very unusual manner and under very unusual circumstances. I don't know if we need to go into that, but it's unfortunately very tragic.
Yeah.
The rest of the band members are alive, though. So, and in their late 70s. So this is an older band than you would think they would be, right, from when they recorded. So that is a little bit of history on Boston. Let's go with Matt. Matt, what are your thoughts on the debut album from Boston?
So overall, they're very positive. This album rocks. This album is very full. It's very energetic. It's very... but it's very crisp and clean. The production is like immaculate here.
When's the last time you heard one of these songs? Also,
I had actually a resurgence of Peace of Mind. I think when John, you sent me one of those reaction videos of these like college kids listening to it for the first time, and it's like that's a song I had known for a while and I always liked, but something like watching that video made me go, I think I like this a lot more than I remember. So I had like a resurgence with that. But More Than a Feeling, God, that song's been around since forever.
I know.
I had a college friend that she loved this and she would play it all the freaking time. So, and I knew Foreplay long time, and I knew Let Me Take You Home Tonight, but I think I probably heard some of these other songs here and there. They weren't as familiar as those four songs, but overall very strong. It was interesting because on the one hand, and I would say this, the 1-2 punch of More Than a Feeling and Peace of Mind is fantastic. It's just like it's just two of the greatest 70s classic rock songs that I've ever heard. They might be the two. I don't know if I don't know. Probably maybe Skinner. We did Skinner last week. Maybe they would have one or two in there as well. But and then Foreplay is kind of like that's like a Yes song or something. Like it gets very proggy, which I liked a lot. And then it goes into Long Time, which that's a great song too. And a couple of the and I think Hitch a Ride and Something About You for me were kind of a little deeper cuts that I really liked, particularly the solo, the second part in Hitch a Ride at the end. The guitar solo was really great. I really liked what they were doing there, and the chorus. They have great choruses, but the chorus in Something About You is very strong as well. I will have to say that like it's interesting because it does have that 70s rock kind of sound, like this is a 70s rock album, but it's also done as good as a 70s classic rock album can sound. I think it's dated, but it's also fresh in certain ways as well, because that guitar sound is just it's so crisp. It almost it's part of the 70s rock establishment, but it also transcends it as well. So I found it a very interesting juxtaposition, and I really don't know if I can do a better job of explaining it than that, but it's something that I definitely felt. I felt both lanes there. I will say, though, there were a couple of downers. I didn't like Smokin' at all. Like that, that seemed a little... It seemed like a ZZ Top song, and it's fine. It's just this blues rock straight up.
I wrote that down too.
Yeah, and I'm just like, okay, and for that type of guitar, again, it sounds better than what it could have sounded, but I still it didn't do much for me. And I thought Rock and Roll Band was a weak track as well. And that's a song where I picked up on the lyrics and not in a good way, because it's just like it's telling this really cheesy, schlocky story about being a rock and roll band, and now it was really tough for a while, and now we finally made it, and it's just like
dancing on the streets of Hyannis.
Yeah, and it's just like, oh god, those lyrics are terrible, and the song itself, I think the chorus was actually saved it a little bit, but I really didn't care for the verses too much. So there's a little parts in here that I'm still not totally in love with, yet I'm just like, I could do without that. But those are really the only two songs that stood out as being ones that I pretty much didn't like. But other than that, it's very. Oh, and I would say that the end, I don't like the way that "Let Me Take You Home Tonight" ends. That like sped up, like frantic ending. I don't know what that is. It's kind of thrown in there, and it kind of diminishes the song a little bit for me. But other than those things, I mean, the strong moments on here are very strong, and I can totally see why it sold a bajillion copies and why they, people would love to see them live and get all into it. This is 70s rock that it does kind of teeter into that I don't know, that classical 70s sound again, but it's
like that Frampton's lane, right?
Yes, but and I only did the Frampton album once, so and I didn't know those songs as well, but this is I like this way more than the Frampton album, so thumbs up for me.
They were the two best-selling albums of 1976, in case you're wondering.
Okay, there you go.
Just for a reference point,
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, at some point along the way, right, Boston kind of became a joke because they were like so overplayed and so well-known and popular that I think there was a backlash, right? And we're probably coming full circle at some point if people are rediscovering Boston now.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll get into that in my thing, but they have a very interesting legacy, I think. But
okay.
I'll expand on that when I give my thoughts.
Oh, and I will just say, and Brad Delp's vocals are fantastic. He's just, I don't know how he hits those notes. It's one of those things where I'm like, are there studio tricks in here? Or is he really like hitting those notes like that? Because some of these are ridiculously high. That's
believe
insane.
it or not. Listen to the isolated tracks. It's basically him.
Wow.
Like, it's pretty remarkable, actually.
Yeah, that's impressive. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I've heard these songs so much, it was hard to hear this album with fresh ears. But I mean, it's a very infectious album. That's kind of the word I get, because the words, because they just kind of get like absorbed into you because you hear the song so much, and then like I'm just singing along and like playing air guitar at certain parts, and I would be really a good experiment would be to have somebody listen to this album that had never heard of Boston before, like a little kid or something. I bet they would love it. I mean, I think that Boston on some level as a, you know, manufacturer.
You should check out reaction videos, Josh,
Yeah.
because there are many people that do that exact thing that you said right there. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, can you trust that? I don't know. We'll see.
I don't know if you can, but the one that I saw, it was pretty fun to watch. I'll give those guys that. Yeah.
So they, as manufactured as Boston is, or at least as developed and worked on as the sound of Boston is, Scholes has somehow like struck a chord at like the core of rock music in some way, because he hits on so many things that just like kind of that resonate with you on a musical level, at least for me. And this rock, while it's very like epic sounding and big, and that arena rock sound, it's still like really entertaining. And I mean, to counterpoint to like Genesis, right, which has a lot of stuff going on in it and is not necessarily trying to, you know, appeal to everyone, or is not going to appeal to everyone. Boston on some level seems to be the music that aliens would hear and say this is what music is to humans or something.
All the way down to the spaceship on the front cover of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So do you guys understand what I'm trying to say? It's some like base level foundational sound of rock music that has been amplified and turned up to.
Well, and
11.
I think particularly maybe for us, because growing up in the 80s, you know, for me, like when you hear so much, you know, hard rock, heavy metal, big guitars, big sounds, you know, Def Leppard, like John said, you know,
Right.
this is kind of in many ways is the beginning of a lot of that. So this is starting to kind of get in those lanes of you know, the borderline stuff that we grew up listening to and the stuff that we didn't grow up listening to.
Yep.
And it's starting to meld together. So that makes a little bit more sense from our perspective, I think.
Yeah, if we did a free association of classic rock acts from when we were kids, this would be like one of the big ones, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, along with Journey and even somebody like Guns N' Roses and stuff. I kind of like, in my head, they're all kind of like melded together into this big hodgepodge, even though Guns N' Roses came later. And I mean, talk about a strong debut, right? This is like the Lynyrd Skynyrd album. I mean, almost every song on here is like really well known and a big hit. Probably, you know, 2/3 of them.
Every song on here was
it's
a single.
crazy.
And I'm not saying that, by the way, as an exaggeration. Every song on
Right.
here was a single. Yeah.
And so that's remarkable in of itself. I don't think I've ever actually listened to the Boston album before preparing for this. So that was a good experience as well. I also caught the fact that Foreplay sounded really proggy in the beginning, and then it transitions into it. So that's interesting because of all the prog rock acts that we've talked about. It's kind of this crossover song in a way from Yes and Moody Blues and Genesis and things like that. Another good thing that I love that they do, hand claps. They got them in multiple songs, and it just like it really just strikes a chord and hammers home the song and singing along and getting
works.
that beat. Yep, it really works. It works for me. And yeah, it's kind of remarkable hearing this again. It's kind of separate. I can't like rank it almost because it's like outside of rankability because it's just something
Non-rankable. It's a non-rankable album.
It's like trying to, I don't know, rank Thriller or something or some other insanely popular album like, I don't know, the Eagles or Rumors or something like that. But yeah, it was fun. It was fun listening to it again, and interesting, you know, going chronologically how, you know, I'm stuck in 72 with Nick Drake and how like far ahead this sounds compared to where we are at in the 70s generally. So yeah, it's enjoyable. If you haven't heard this album or if you somehow are listening to this podcast and haven't heard Boston, then go listen to it.
John, Wikipedia disagrees with you. It says there were only 3 singles on this record. More
Yeah,
Than Feeling,
Wikipedia-
Long Time, and Peace of Mind were officially the singles.
I believe Wikipedia also said the entire album receives constant rotation on classic rock radio.
That it does,
focusing on
yes.
constant, yes, and entire. So yes, that's what I was going off of. That well, and that segues perfectly into me. Like, I had heard this album before I'd actually ever heard this album as a kid, because Matt mentioned the big hits, like Acting Like Rock and Roll Band and Smokin' and Hitch a Ride, right? You know, aren't gigantic freaking hits that I heard on the I heard those songs on the radio hundreds of times growing up. So like, I knew this album up, back, and down before I ever listened to it. So much like Josh said, it existed in like a place where it was omnipresent before I even did it. And Boston also, because 15 to 20 years worth of bands spent a long amount of time trying to sound like them. In that way, they're like how Van Halen is, right? That they begat all these bands that tried to do kind of what they did, to the point where you almost listen to the stuff that like a Boston or a Van Halen did and don't realize how revolutionary it was, because so many people took the things and watered it down and I think that's what happened to Boston, right?
Yeah.
That and they disappeared, and when they came back, it was the 80s, and people hadn't grown up with them in the newest generation, right? And so it sounded like, this Boston band's trying to sound like Def Leppard, right? Not realizing that they list, and then they disappear again. It's grunge, and of course then Boston doesn't mean anything to anybody. So they kind of just faded out of consciousness. But I'll start with the only thing. I mean, Boston's lyrics are always not great, and so Matt's right. I mean, the lyrics are very straight ahead. But here's the thing. This is a Matt album in the sense that this album's not designed to have profound lyrics. This is designed, this Peace of Mind, for years and years and years, when my friends would drive to the Jersey Shore, there would be certain songs we put on when we crossed the bridge into the, when we were going to go to the shore, right? And Peace of Mind was a staple for that, because you just get in a good mood instantaneously amongst hearing it. There's these big guitar sounds, but very tight, very synthetic production. On paper, if you told me what this album sounds like, it doesn't sound like anything that I would normally like as a, punk rock, grittier, type guy that I grew up on. This is none of that. This is sheeny, polished. And the fact that he did this in his basement studio makes it even more fascinating that it sounds this sheeny and polished.
Yeah, right.
Because it's they told him to go get it professionally produced. He's like, yeah, fuck that noise. And
he's got a good basement setup, I'll tell you that.
Well, and then he basically did a sheeny production thing that you would think you'd go to it for, right? But I think it's weird if you put this on for anybody who likes rock and they don't react to this. Like, it's the core of big guitars, soaring vocals, very not complicated, but very understandable bass lines. The drums are sometimes buried and sometimes pushed to the front, depending on whatever the hell Tom Scholz wants you to pay attention to the guitar in at the time. And the harmonies, the hand claps and stuff like that, the layered productions all over this place. I've been saying to you guys for years, like, I'm shocked that no one in the last 15 years sounds like Boston. I don't know how some band can't go, you know what we're going to try to do? Be the modern Boston. Because when somebody does that, they're going to sell not albums, right? But they're going to sell 1,000 tickets, like jillions of tickets per show. And it's going to happen. And someone will eventually do it. But weirdly, no one has decided to be modern Boston. And it's just mind-boggling to me. Because this sound, you could take this and plop it in now. And would it have a little bit of a nostalgic sound? Yeah. But could you also take this and make it a 2021 sound? Immediately taking out some of the 70s yes,
I think so,
immediately. And so I just keep waiting for someone to put it out, and I'll go, oh, that's the band that's going to be the modern Boston. And wait till you see how many downloads this band gets on Spotify and Apple, because they'll sell a ton, and you'll hear the album all over the place, and it will probably win best rock album at the Grammys. Because it's I think the landscape of rock of music right now, there is not a lot of rock. And in my opinion, guys, the rock that's most likely to be the one that people will play and that will break through is this type of sounding rock.
Well, this album has so much crossover appeal, right? It's like young, old, man, woman, like everybody can.
That's why I
get
think
behind
it is.
it. Yeah,
It's pop. It's pop rock, which what the key and the next big rock band is going to have to come in that thing, because you really can't go and tour and make a name for yourself like that anymore. So it's going to be something like this. So mark my words, guys. I don't know when it will happen, but sometime in the next 20 years, someone will be the next Boston, and they'll update this sound, and they will be one of the 5 biggest acts in the world, because it's just mind-boggling to me that no one has done it really since like the 80s.
Well, you got to think that. I mean, I think we've talked about this before too, about how rock and roll is not as. I mean, it's not on any top 40 radio. It's not like top selling, singles or albums or streams. I guess that's what they're going by now. But you got to think that something like this is going to make a resurgence at some point. There's going to be kids going through their fathers or even their grandfather's record collection, finding stuff and being like, we need to, exactly, start doing stuff like this. So, but yeah, and you know what too, John? I was thinking, I just remembered this on Peace of Mind, and there might have been other parts on there too. There's triple guitar thread on here. There's triple harmonies on the guitars, and I was like,
layered. It's the layered sound.
Oh yeah, I was like, that's the other great thing about Peace of Mind is the way that it builds, and they kind of tease you. You think the song's over, and then the acoustic guitar comes in, and then they do it again, and it's like, So they play with you. They play with your emotions like that a little bit. They kind of draw you in, and they're taking you on a ride. And it's there's a lot of parts in this album where I just started smiling, because it was just like, man, that's cool. That's just a really fun, great sound. So it's a very well done, well done record.
I'm a much bigger fan of Rock and Roll Band and Hitch a Ride than you are, Matt. I think both those songs are awesome. And like I said, they're not profound.
I liked Hitch a Ride. It was Smoking that I didn't like. It was Smoking
and I like Smoking too, but I would say a little. But they're not designed to be complicated. They're designed to be played and put you in a good mood, and designed to be played loud in a car or that's the thing. This is something you could put on at work and it would work, or it's something you could put on like unironically while waiting for a cool band to play, and someone will go, "Oh, I like this. What is this?
Yeah.
Oh, it's Boston. Oh, I thought Boston kind of sucked." No, they don't kind of. That's kind of the thing with like the amount of people who like hear Boston and go, "Oh, do they kind of suck?" And then you hear it and go, "Oh, they kind of don't suck." I don't know if there's any band that has that conversation play out more, right? Than, I never knew Boston had these songs that kicked ass, And so. And if you like this album, the second album sounds almost exactly the same. So you can check that one out too.
I will say that like some of the starts of these songs sound very similar to one another, so you can't identify the song right away until a little
Well, it's
later
usually
on.
he just is plowing on into guitar, right? You know what I mean? Like layered guitar just comes out from the there'll be a void, and then all of a sudden you hear like it sounds like it's like a chorus guitar, but it will front load it and then usually at down tempos. The classic example is so you get this big thing, and then it's like and then like the bass line comes down, and then you have like right when it's down tempo, and then you've got like Brad Delp, with his like when you got a piece of that like huge thing, and it's like whoa, it kind of all comes together. So it's very enjoyable and very unlike anything we've heard in the 70s so far. It won't be unlike things we will hear down the road,
right.
but very unlike anything we've heard, having been mostly in the early 70s, because this does not originate from the early 70s in terms of the sound. Like his influences are from the 70s, but this sounds 4 years but light years away from like what the popular music scene is.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, this is almost like a Deep Purple level, like arena rock in a way. I wonder if they were an influence on him.
It doesn't come up. A lot of his is like 60s, like guitar rock, and even like 50s guitar rock. And he's like a guy that I think likes guitar sounds. But I don't think he's as, wedded to some of the same guitar idols, that other people did. I think his is more, how can I make this guitar sound cool? Let me build a pedal, and then it kind of, So.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the. I didn't know anything about their bio, so I just assumed they kept making records, but that's clearly not the case.
Oh no, they're an infamous. I do remember. Story, yeah.
I do remember my brother got Third Stage on tape. I think it was tape or CD, and I remember him telling me like, "Yeah, this is like a band that was like really big in the '70s, and then they just went away and they disappeared, and nobody knew what happened to them, and then they came out with this, So he was all excited about it. I remember that, but.
And that's there, and that's the funny thing about what music used to be too, that there was way more mystery there, where when you weren't releasing an album for 8 years, people thought you might be dead and stuff, like, or just went to like fucking Dexter and like moved to like a town and like became a lumberjack.
It's so different
now. You never do that.
Yeah, now you know what the guy had for breakfast that day, because
well, and also even if somebody goes away, there's 1,000. Where is this person now? And you can search it, and you just don't have that anonymity like it
shows
was
up
before.
on somebody's TikTok video that they saw him walking out getting groceries or something.
So strong recommend for me. It's awesome.
Recommend.